Welcome to True.
What Really Happened to Hitler's Daughter After World War II, full documentary, The Women Who Claimed to Be Hitler's Daughter. Several women over the decades have claimed to be his daughter, though none gained significant credibility among historians. In the immediate post-war period, various women in Germany and Austria made claims of being related to Hitler, often seeking financial support or attempting to claim property that had belonged to the Nazi leader. These claims were investigated by Allied occupation authorities and consistently found to lack merit. One persistent rumor involved a woman in Argentina where Hitler was rumored by some conspiracy theorists to have escaped after the war. This woman, whose full identity was never reliably established in historical records, claimed in the 1950s to be Hitler's daughter by Eva Braun, allegedly smuggled out of Germany as an infant before the war's end. This claim coincided with the broader myth that Hitler had escaped to South America, a theory that has been thoroughly debunked by historical evidence, including Soviet autopsy records and witness testimonies. Another claim emerged from a woman in the United States in the 1960s who told family members she was Hitler's daughter. Her story involved a secret pregnancy of one of Hitler's early girlfriends and an adoption arranged by Nazi officials. Like other claims, this lacked any documentary evidence and contradicted the well-documented chronology of Hitler's life and relationships. These claims share common characteristics. They emerged years or decades after the war, relied on unprovable oral traditions or deathbed revelations, lacked documentary evidence, and contradicted the established historical record. None have withstood serious historical scrutiny. The question itself contains a fundamental historical error that has persisted in popular imagination and conspiracy theories for decades. Adolf Hitler had no daughter, despite countless rumors, alleged testimonies, and sensationalized claims that have circulated since the end of World War II. There is no credible historical evidence that Hitler fathered any children, male or female. However, the persistent nature of these rumors, the various women who have claimed to be Hitler's daughter, and the cultural fascination with this question reveal something profound about how we process the legacy of one of history's most notorious figures. This story explores the truth behind these claims, the women who made them, and why the myth of Hitler's daughter continues to captivate public imagination nearly 80 years after the fall of the Third Reich. The historical record, Hitler's personal life. To understand why the question of Hitler's daughter persists, we must first examine what historians actually know about Adolf Hitler's personal and romantic life. Hitler's relationships with women were unusual, secretive, and have been the subject of intense historical scrutiny. Hitler maintained a carefully crafted public image as a man married only to Germany, dedicating his entire existence to the German people. This persona was deliberately cultivated to present himself as a selfless leader with no personal life that might distract from his political mission. Behind this facade, however, Hitler did have romantic relationships, though they were carefully hidden from public view. The most documented relationship was with Eva Braun, whom Hitler met in 1929 when she was just 17 years old and working as an assistant to his personal photographer, Heinrich Hoffmann. Their relationship lasted until their deaths in 1945, yet Eva Braun remained virtually unknown to the German public throughout the Nazi era. She was kept in the background, spending much of her time at Hitler's Berghof retreat in the Bavarian Alps, forbidden from appearing in public with him or being photographed by anyone other than Hitler's official photographer. Hitler and Eva Braun married in a small civil ceremony in the Führer bunker in Berlin on April 29, 1945, less than 40 hours before their joint suicide. This marriage, performed as Soviet forces closed in on the bunker, was witnessed by Joseph Goebbels and Martin Bormann. The next day, as the Battle of Berlin reached its final stages, Hitler and Braun committed suicide, Hitler by gunshot and Braun by cyanide poisoning. Their bodies were then burned in the Reich Chancellery Garden by remaining staff members. Historical records, including extensive testimonies from Hitler's inner circle, personal staff, and Eva Braun's own diaries and letters, contain no evidence of any children. Eva Braun's diaries, which have been authenticated by historians, express her loneliness and frustration at being kept in the shadows of Hitler's life, but they make no mention of pregnancy or children. Before Eva Braun, Hitler had other romantic relationships. His half-niece, Galie Raubal, lived with him in his Munich apartment from 1929 until her death in 1931. Galie died from a gunshot wound in Hitler's apartment under circumstances that remained disputed, officially ruled a suicide, but surrounded by persistent questions. Again, there is no evidence of any child resulting from this relationship. Hitler's personal physician, Dr. Theodor Morell, maintained detailed medical records that have been studied extensively by historians. These records contain no indication of Hitler fathering any children, though they do reveal his declining health and the cocktail of medications he received daily. The first claims, Jean-Marie Loret. The most persistent claim of being Hitler's child came from a Frenchman named Jean-Marie Loret, who asserted until his death in 1985 that he was Hitler's son, not daughter. However, his story is relevant because it represents the template for many subsequent claims and reveals how such myths originate. According to Loret's account, Hitler had a brief affair with his mother, Charlotte Lovejoy, when he was a soldier stationed in France during World War I. Lovejoy allegedly told her son about his paternity when he was young, though the timing and circumstances of these revelations have been questioned by historians. Loret's claims gained some media attention, particularly in France, but they have been largely dismissed by serious historians. DNA testing conducted on Loret's descendants decades after his death proved inconclusive and could not definitively establish or disprove the connection. The historical evidence places Hitler in locations during World War I that make the alleged encounter unlikely, though not impossible. What makes Loret's case significant is that it demonstrates the pattern followed by many who claim Hitler parentage: stories passed down through family, late revelations of parentage, lack of contemporaneous documentation, and the impossibility of definitive proof without Hitler's own DNA samples. Why the myth persists. The question of Hitler's children, particularly a daughter, persists in popular imagination for several interconnected psychological, cultural, and historical reasons. First, there is the human tendency to personalize evil. Hitler represents almost incomprehensible evil in the historical record. His regime was responsible for the Holocaust, which murdered 6 million Jews, as well as millions of other victims, including Roma, disabled individuals, political prisoners, and others. World War II in Europe caused tens of millions of deaths. Contemplating such evil on this scale is psychologically difficult. The idea of Hitler having a daughter humanizes him in some way, making him more comprehensible by connecting his monstrous public actions to ordinary human experiences like parenthood. Second, the myth of Hitler's hidden daughter feeds into broader conspiracies about Nazi escapes and hidden treasures. After the war, many Nazis did escape prosecution, most famously through rat lines to South America. Real figures like Josef Mengele and Adolf Eichmann lived in hiding for years after the war. These factual escapes have been embroidered with fictional elements, including the myth that Hitler himself escaped, perhaps with family members in tow. Third, there is a morbid cultural fascination with what happened to the families of notorious criminals and dictators. The children of famous murderers, terrorists, and dictators have long been subjects of public interest. People wonder whether evil can be inherited, how children cope with monstrous parentage, and whether redemption is possible for those who carry such names. This fascination extends to Hitler's actual relatives, particularly his nephew, William Patrick Hitler, who served in the U.S. Navy during World War II, and whose descendants allegedly made a pact never to have children to end Hitler's bloodline. Fourth, the absolute nature of Hitler's evil creates a kind of vacuum in narrative terms. In literature and film, even the worst villains often have humanizing elements, family connections, love relationships, moments of vulnerability. The historical Hitler, as documented by survivors and historians, showed remarkably little humanity in his final years. The myth of a daughter creates a narrative gap that fiction often fills. What if Hitler had someone he loved, someone who might have softened him, or who now carries the burden of his legacy? Finally, gaps in the historical record, particularly regarding Hitler's personal life before he became famous, create space for speculation. While Hitler's life from 1933 onward was extensively documented, his earlier years are less completely recorded. These gaps, combined with his secretiveness about his personal relationships, allow myths to flourish. The real Hitler relatives after the war. While Hitler had no children, he did have living relatives at the end of World War II, and their fates are well documented and provide insight into how society treated those who bore Hitler's name. Hitler's sister Paula Hitler, born Paula Wolf, and later known as Paula Wolf, survived the war. She had worked in an insurance office in Vienna and lived quietly during the Nazi era, though she received financial support from her brother. After the war, Paula was interrogated by U.S. intelligence officers. She lived in seclusion until her death in 1960, giving only a few interviews in which she maintained that her brother had a warm heart, and that she knew nothing of his crimes. She never married and had no children. Hitler's half-siblings from his father's earlier marriages produced the Hitler family line that survived into the post-war era. His half-brother Alois Hitler Jr. had two sons, Heinrich Hitler, who was killed in combat during World War II, and William Patrick Hitler, whose story is particularly remarkable. William Patrick Hitler, born in Liverpool to Alois Jr. and his Irish wife, Bridget Dowling, was Hitler's nephew. In the 1930s, William attempted to benefit from his famous uncle's name, even trying to get employment through the connection. He visited Germany several times, and allegedly threatened to reveal embarrassing family information unless given appropriate employment. Hitler's relationship with William was contentious and frustrated. William and his mother emigrated to the United States in 1939, just before the war began. In 1944, William Patrick Hitler joined the United States Navy, serving as a pharmacist's mate. He was wounded in service and received a Purple Heart. After the war, William changed his name to William Stewart Houston and lived quietly on Long Island, New York. He married and had 4 sons. William Patrick Stewart Houston died in 1987. According to some accounts, William's sons made a pact never to have children themselves, effectively ending Hitler's bloodline. However, this claim has been disputed, and the surviving Stewart Houston brothers have maintained strict privacy, declining all interview requests. One brother, Alexander Adolf Stewart Houston, whose middle name his parents gave him before changing their surname, worked as a social worker in Long Island. Another brother, Louis Stewart Houston, became a landscaper. They have lived ordinary, anonymous lives, bearing the burden of their ancestry in private. Hitler's other half-sibling relationships produced few descendants. His half-sister Angela Hitler had a daughter, Gaily Raubel, who was Hitler's half-niece and romantic interest, who died in 1931. Angela's son Leo Raubel fought in the Wehrmacht and was captured by the Soviets, dying in captivity in 1977. The treatment of these relatives after the war varied. None were prosecuted for crimes, as there was no evidence they participated in Nazi atrocities. However, they carried an inescapable stigma. Most chose anonymity, changing names, or living in obscurity. Their stories are not of hidden daughters emerging from secret pregnancies, but of ordinary people trying to escape the shadow of humanity's most infamous monster. Historical evidence and DNA. Why we know Hitler had no children. The question of whether Hitler had children is not a matter of opinion or interpretation. It is a historical question that can be addressed through documentary evidence, testimony, and forensic analysis. Multiple lines of evidence converge to establish that Hitler had no children. Documentary evidence. Hitler's life, particularly from 1933 onward, was extensively documented. His daily schedule, movements, and activities were recorded by aides, adjutants, secretaries, and staff. Eva Braun's life was similarly documented, particularly her time at the Berghof. These records contain no indication of pregnancy, childbirth, or children. Hitler's personal finances, controlled by Martin Bormann, show no expenditures for children's care or support. Nazi bureaucracy, infamous for its meticulous record-keeping, contains no birth records, identity documents, or other paperwork for any Hitler children. Witness testimony. Hundreds of people from Hitler's inner circle survived the war and were extensively interviewed by Allied intelligence, journalists, and historians. These included his secretaries, personal adjutants, domestic staff, bodyguards, doctors, and close associates like Albert Speer. None reported any children. Eva Braun's family, including her sisters Ilse and Gretel, survived the war and gave extensive interviews. They never mentioned any children. This consistency across hundreds of independent witnesses is compelling evidence. Hitler's health. Records. Dr. Theodor Morell's medical records for Hitler have been studied by medical historians. While Hitler suffered from numerous health problems, particularly in his later years, and was given an extraordinary array of medications, including methamphetamine, a fact that has become widely known in recent decades, there is no indication in these records of Hitler having fathered children. Additionally, some historians have speculated based on medical evidence that Hitler may have suffered from conditions that could have affected his fertility, though this remains speculative. Eva Braun's diaries and letters. Eva Braun's personal diaries and letters have been authenticated by historians. They reveal a lonely woman, often frustrated by her relationship with Hitler, jealous of his attention to politics and other women, and deeply insecure about her position in his life. She attempted suicide twice before their relationship stabilized. Her writings contain no mention of pregnancy or children. Given the personal nature of these documents, intended for her private use, the absence of any such mention is significant. Soviet autopsy records. After Soviet forces captured the Reich Chancellery, they found the burned remains of Hitler and Eva Braun. Soviet pathologists conducted an autopsy on the remains, which were later reburied and exhumed multiple times before finally being cremated and disposed of in 1970. While the Soviet records were kept secret for decades and have been questioned on some details, they confirmed the identification of Hitler and Braun through dental records. DNA testing on skull fragments allegedly from Hitler, conducted in 2009, revealed those particular fragments were actually from a woman, casting doubt on some Soviet evidence. However, in 2017, French researchers were allowed to examine Hitler's teeth held in Moscow and definitively confirmed through comparisons with wartime dental records and testimony from Hitler's dentist that these were indeed Hitler's remains. DNA analysis. Modern DNA analysis has been applied to Hitler relatives and to claims of Hitler parentage. The surviving Hitler/Stuart Houston line has maintained privacy, but DNA analyses of other claimed descendants have failed to establish connections. In 2010, researchers analyzed Y chromosome DNA from Hitler's known relatives and found haplogroup E1b1b, relatively rare among Western Europeans. This genetic marker could theoretically be used to test claims of paternal descent, though no verified matches have emerged. Logical analysis. Beyond direct evidence, logical analysis of Hitler's circumstances makes hidden children unlikely. Hitler was intensely concerned with his public image and legacy. If he had fathered children, particularly with Eva Braun, it is unlikely he would have kept them completely hidden, especially as his regime became secure. Nazi ideology emphasized fertility, family, and the continuation of pure bloodlines. A child would have fit Hitler's propaganda narrative, the extreme secrecy that would have been required to hide a child from everyone in Hitler's circle, in an era of intensive surveillance both by his own regime and by foreign intelligence services, strains credibility. The cultural legacy, fiction, and film. The absence of historical evidence for Hitler's children has not prevented the topic from becoming a staple of fiction, revealing how culture processes the questions raised by Hitler's evil. Numerous novels have explored the theme of Hitler's children or descendants. Ira Levin's The Boys from Brazil, 1976, later adapted into a film, imagined a plot to create clones of Hitler. While not about a daughter, it explored themes of genetic evil, and whether Hitler's evil could be replicated biologically. The novel suggested that both genetics and environment shaped Hitler, requiring his clones to be raised in circumstances similar to Hitler's childhood. Other novels have directly addressed the idea of Hitler's daughter. Jackie French's young adult novel, Hitler's Daughter, 1999, uses a framed story to explore what it would mean to be Hitler's child, examining questions of inherited guilt and moral responsibility. The novel uses fiction to engage young readers with historical questions about the Holocaust and personal responsibility. Films and television programs have repeatedly returned to these themes. The fascination extends beyond Hitler to the children of other Nazi leaders. Documentaries and films have explored the real lives of descendants of Göring, Himmler, Hess, and other Nazi leaders, examining how they coped with their family legacy. These real stories often prove more compelling than fiction. Katrin Himmler married an Israeli whose family survived the Holocaust. Nicholas Frank spent his life denouncing his father. Nazi governor Hans Frank and Bettina Göring, Hermann Göring's grandniece, was sterilized to ensure she would never pass on her family's genes. This cultural production reveals a persistent fascination with biological inheritance of evil. The question underlying these works is whether someone can inherit guilt or evil predisposition, a question with disturbing historical precedents in eugenics and racial theories, including those promoted by the Nazis themselves. The irony that our fascination with Hitler's potential descendants echoes Nazi beliefs about biological determinism is rarely acknowledged. The broader question, children of dictators and criminals, the question of what happened to Hitler's daughter, despite being based on a false premise, connects to genuine historical questions about the children of dictators and mass murderers. Stalin's children had varied fates. His son Yakov died in German captivity during World War II. His son Vasily became a Soviet Air Force general, but struggled with alcoholism and died in 1962. His daughter Svetlana Alliluyeva defected to the United States in 1967. Writing memoirs that denounced her father's regime, she struggled throughout her life with her identity, changing names and countries multiple times before dying in 2011. Mussolini's children produced descendants who have remained active in Italian public life. His granddaughter Alessandra Mussolini has been a politician, actress, and model, defending her grandfather's legacy while claiming to reject fascism. This public embrace of a dictator's lineage contrasts sharply with German treatment of the Nazi legacy. Mao Zedong's children and grandchildren have become part of China's elite, with some active in business and politics. Gaddafi's children scattered after his violent death in 2011, with various fates including death in combat, exile, and imprisonment. The children of ordinary criminals face different but related challenges. The children of serial killers often change their names and live in anonymity, while some have written memoirs or given interviews about their experiences. Some become advocates for victims' rights or criminal justice reform, trying to create meaning from their parentage. What emerges from these comparative cases is that no simple pattern exists. Some children embrace their parents' legacy, others violently reject it, and many struggle silently with an identity they did not choose. Inherited guilt is a complex philosophical and psychological question that simple answers cannot address. Why historical truth matters. The persistence of myths about Hitler's daughter, despite clear historical evidence of their falsity, raises important questions about how we engage with history and why historical truth matters. First, false narratives about Hitler's personal life can serve to humanize and normalize him in dangerous ways. While understanding Hitler as a human being rather than simply a monster is important for historical comprehension, invented stories of hidden daughters create a false narrative that can distort our understanding of his character and crimes. Second, these myths exemplify how conspiracy theories function. They begin with gaps in knowledge or understanding, add speculation and rumor, create elaborate explanations that cannot be definitively disproven, and persist despite contrary evidence because they serve psychological or ideological needs. Understanding why the Hitler's daughter myth persists helps us understand how other historical conspiracy theories function and spread. Third, false narratives can cause real harm. Those claiming to be Hitler's descendants, or those alleged to be, face serious consequences in their lives. The Stuart Houston brothers, Hitler's actual relatives, have lived their entire lives under the shadow of their ancestry despite bearing no responsibility for Hitler's actions. False claims create additional confusion and can subject innocent people to suspicion or harassment. Fourth, historical accuracy about the Holocaust and World War II remains vitally important. As the generation with direct memory of these events passes away, accurate historical records become increasingly crucial. False narratives about Hitler, even relatively minor ones about his personal life, contribute to broader historical distortion. Holocaust denial and Nazi apologism remain serious problems in many parts of the world. Maintaining rigorous historical standards about all aspects of this history serves as a bulwark against revisionism. Finally, the question of Hitler's daughter reveals how we struggle with the legacy of evil. We want simple answers to complex questions. Can evil be inherited? Could someone related to Hitler be good? Would Hitler's daughter bear guilt for his crimes? These are profound moral and philosophical questions without easy answers. The mythical Hitler's daughter serves as a projection screen for these anxieties, allowing us to explore them in fictional terms rather than confronting the actual moral complexities of the Nazi legacy. Conclusion: the truth and the myth. The simple historical truth is that Adolf Hitler had no daughter, he had no sons, he had no children at all, as confirmed by overwhelming documentary evidence, witness testimony, and logical analysis. The women who have claimed to be his daughter over the decades have produced no credible evidence, and their claims contradict established historical facts. Hitler's actual relatives after the war faced genuine challenges bearing his name, but they were nieces, nephews, and more distant relations, not children. Most chose anonymity and ordinary lives, bearing their burden in private. Yet the myth persists, revealing more about us than about Hitler. Our fascination with Hitler's potential daughter demonstrates how we process incomprehensible evil by trying to personalize it, how we wonder about biological inheritance of moral character, and how we struggle with questions of guilt and responsibility across generations. Understanding that Hitler had no daughter is a minor historical fact in the context of his enormous crimes, but our persistent questioning of this fact, our willingness to entertain claims and conspiracies despite contrary evidence, reveals something about how we engage with difficult history. We sometimes prefer compelling narratives to uncomfortable truths. The real story of Hitler's relatives after World War II is less dramatic than myths about hidden daughters, but more instructive. Real people carried the burden of Hitler's name through no fault of their own. Most chose obscurity over notoriety, privacy over profiting from their infamous connection. Their quiet lives of ordinary work and family, deliberately distanced from their ancestors' evil, represent perhaps the only honorable response to such a legacy. In the end, there is no lost Hitler daughter emerging from hiding, no secret child who escaped to South America, no heir to the Nazi legacy waiting to reveal herself. There is only history, documented and verifiable, and the myths we create when history is too painful to confront directly. The question of what happened to Hitler's daughter after World War II has a simple answer. Nothing happened to her because she never existed, but the question itself, and our continued asking of it, will likely persist as long as we struggle to understand how such evil became possible and what responsibility, if any, subsequent generations bear for the crimes of their ancestors.